If you're thinking about buying your dream property in Panama, but you're feeling a little unsure of the legal process, today is your lucky day. I've brought in the big guns to help you understand the process of buying in Panama, from offer to closing. Ricardo Faraudo, who founded Denfab Law in 2005, has helped countless expats and investors make smart, secure real estate moves in Panama. Whether it's a charming resale or a shiny new pre-construction unit, Ricardo's here to spill the legal secrets you really need to know before signing on the dotted line. Welcome to the Panama Podcast, from dreaming to doing. I'm your host, Melissa Darnay. If you want insider tips on living, investing, and having a blast in Panama, go to choosepanama.com and snag your free copy of Panama Uncorked. Ricardo, welcome back to the Panama Podcast.
Well, thank you for having me back. It's good to be here.
Let's jump right in the deep end. The biggest question, what are the main differences between buying property in Panama versus buying property in the US or Canada?
That's a good question. I think, first of all, there's a lot less paperwork here. Like,
for sure.
From my clients in the past, what they've told me, like when you're buying property in the US and Canada, you're filling out like a ton of paperwork.
Hand cramps
Yeah.
from signatures.
Secondly, we don't require title insurance here in Panama. The reason is mainly because we have the public registry, which is one of our best government offices. It has very clear title on all the properties, and it covers the entire country. So it's one government institution that covers the entire country, where everything is registered, where we can verify everything, and you don't have to worry about title insurance.
And that's amazing, coming from countries where it's maybe county by county to have the different registrations, to have everything for the whole country all in one place.
Correct.
Now, is it legal for foreigners to own property outright?
Yes, of course. Now, there's a lot of misconceptions. Some people think that they need to buy properties in a corporation or foundation. That's not true. You can perfectly buy property in your personal name. There's nothing that stops you from owning property, whether you are a foreigner, a resident, or a citizen. The situation is the same.
There is just that limitation, though, that where someone who's not a citizen can't buy property within, 10 kilometers of a foreign border.
Correct. Well, there's certain restrictions. It's 10 kilometers of a foreign border. Like if you're a foreigner, you cannot buy rights of possession and title it, and you cannot own islands, which goes also towards rights of possession and then title it.
Okay.
Most people just, if they're actually going to do that, they can do that through a corporation.
Okay. Now, why do you think Panama has become such a hot spot for foreign investors right now?
There's a lot of reasons. Number one, I think it's the connectivity. Panama is the center of the Americas. It's very easy to go North America, South America, Europe, the Caribbean, the airline hub, the canal, the US dollar, the internet connectivity. It's a logistics place. There's a lot of people that are able to work online or just use Panama as a home base to travel, to visit their customers, clients. There's many reasons that clients are telling me why every time they go do the research of this country and the other, Panama starts checking all the boxes.
And it's interesting to me because now at this stage, I've been here now, I'm in my 13th year in Panama. Now connectivity is so important to me, but that's not my reason I moved to Panama. The reason I moved here was, natural beauty, good weather, a welcoming community. But once you get here and it becomes your place to live, that connectivity becomes so important. And again, whether it's internet connectivity or whether it's just the ability to get on a plane and go where you want to go.
Yes, definitely. I mean, you don't realize it until if you're, for example, in South America and you have to go to North America, you're stopping in Panama anyway.
That's right. Thank you, Copa Airlines.
Yeah.
Ricardo, can you walk us through the typical legal process for purchasing a resale property in Panama?
Okay. So generally, I will meet with a client whenever they're interested in looking for property and kind of give them a brief overview of what is the real estate transaction process here, where you're looking at doing a promise of purchase agreement and then the final closing and all the ins and outs of it. And then just basically tell them, well, go find your property, which they do with a realtor, and whenever they find
With me.
yes, whenever they find the property, what I tell them is to get the property number. With the property number, like even sometimes if they want us to start working or making sure everything's right before they make an offer and an offer is accepted, or before they analyze the amount that they want to offer, with the property number, we can go into the public registry. We can verify everything in the property. We can see who owns it, the size, if it has any liens, the history of the property, what it has been sold and bought for, who the previous owner was, just verify everything. So we generally, with the property number, do a due diligence report, which we send to the client that has all this information. And then, the idea is that once they make an offer and it is accepted, we start immediately working on the promise of purchase agreement so we can move forward to sign the contract.
Let's talk about the promise to purchase agreement. What is it and how does it work?
Okay. The promise of purchase agreement is an agreement where the seller agrees to sell the property at a certain price, and we establish what his obligations are during the transaction, which generally are to obtain all the good standings of the property. We're talking about HOA, water bill, property tax, everything. Here in Panama, one of the good things is that properties, when they're transferred, they have to be transferred with no liens. So the public registry overall makes sure that properties are always transferred clean. And then the buyer, his obligation is generally to do a down payment at the signature of the promise of purchase agreement. That down payment generally is 10%. It could be 20%, depends on what is negotiated. And then do the final payment at closing.
What documents should a buyer request or review when buying a resale?
Okay. I think it's very important to first understand what is the property tax and the valuation of the property. That number one, because, properties could be valued at a higher price than what you're buying or a lower price than what you're buying. This can all help determine how we want to buy. Because when you're going to buy the property, you can just buy the title outright. But also many buyers, for example, have the property in a corporation. And if it were convenient, because let's say if the property has a much lower value than the price that you are paying, it could be convenient to buy the shares of the corporation and keep that property value low.
Ricardo, how important is due diligence, and what does your firm typically check for before a sale is finalized?
Okay, so it's very important to do due diligence. It also helps us, once we get the property number, to understand what's the best way to advise our clients in setting up the structure of the purchase. Generally, I would say most of the time I advise clients to just buy the title outright directly, have a transfer of title from the previous owner to the buyer. But sometimes it could be more advantageous to just buy the shares of a corporation if it's registered in the name of a corporation.
Can we unpack that a little bit? Mm-hmm. So if there's a corporation, ABC company that owns a property in Casa Bonita.
Okay.
So instead of going from Ricardo, your name, to my name, it is actually staying in the public registry as ABC Corporation.
Correct.
But we're just transferring the shares. So you used to own 100% of the shares and you're selling it to me, and now I'm buying 100% of those shares.
Correct. Okay. So that would be the transaction.
Yes.
Now, I don't recommend to do that most of the time, but there are scenarios where, for example, let's say the property is registered at a much lower value and you're buying at a much higher value. that would come up in the due diligence report. And at that point, we could say, hey, you know what? It might be more tax advantageous going forward with a property tax for you to buy the shares of the company and keep the value lower than to do a transfer of title and raise the property value to your current
asking price. Okay, that makes sense. Is there anything else?
Yes, I also think, it's important in these mature buildings, well, I mean mature, but they have more than 5 years old, etc. It's not crucial, but I do think it's important to ask for the financials of the building and kind of know what is the status of, is everyone paying their HOA? Does the building have money? Do they cover their expenses? Because the building, like anything, it's an ongoing.
Right.
And you want to know that it's going to be more or less how it's administered and if it's going to be as you expect.
And how the buildings are maintained.
Correct.
I mean, the building I live in, we live on the ocean. So we have to have the building painted every 4 to 5 years. That's a couple $100,000 every time. Usually you do some sort of assessment at that time, but you do want to make sure that the building has money. That's great advice.
Yes, and to elaborate on that, I mean, I've had clients ask me in the past, they're worried about additional assessments. I think it's okay if every 4 or 5 years you just get one for the painting of the building, and that would be fine. But what you don't want really is necessarily every year having another one because, the gym needs a fix.
Exactly.
Or the pool is going down. So you want to know that the building gets enough money with their current cash flow to cover the expenses of have a little extra for these things that just normally wear and tear that happen.
That's right. Are there any red flags that buyers should be aware of?
Red flags from who? Like the seller or what specifically?
Just red flags in any situation when they're buying a resale.
I think overall being rushed.
Okay.
I think overall, I always feel that things need to take their proper course. It doesn't have to be slow, right? Like, so if you find the property, there's a normal process. You find the property, you make an offer, it's normal for it to take a couple of days to draft an agreement and have a back and forth. Maybe, hey, I'm going to do a corporation in the middle. When you have somebody that's like very eager and or sometimes fighting you things, like for example, I'll give you an example.
Okay.
So we have certain standard things that are in a promise of purchase agreement, right? One of them is like the penalty clause. So we're going to give a down payment and it's standard that the seller, his penalty clause is if he doesn't comply, he's going to return the down payment plus an additional amount that's equal to the down payment. That's his penalty.
So for example, if someone is buying a $300,000 property, their 10% down would be $30,000.
Correct.
So the penalty clause would be they have to give back that $30,000 plus an additional $30,000 for a total of $60,000 because they broke the contract.
Correct, because if they just give you back the $30,000 that you received, that's not a penalty.
Right.
So you can just back out for anything.
Right.
So that's the penalty. So if you're like, let's say that's a standard thing, and I send the contract over to the seller's lawyer or the seller, and they go like, I'm not signing with a penalty and this and that and the other, and these are very standard things. For me, that's a red flag. Like, why? Do you want to sell? If you want to sell, then you shouldn't be having these issues with things that would only be an issue if you back out.
Right.
So for example, those things that are just like, ultimately, when you're doing resales, you're dealing with people. So if you see certain things that they're kind of complicated, understand you're getting into a transaction with this complicated person.
And the other thing that's interesting to me is that the typical promise to purchase contract is only about 8 pages in Panama. And I've dealt with your company a lot. It's about 8 pages and it's 4 in English and 4 in Spanish. So for an American specifically, that's a very short contract. Now I have noticed, over the years as I've been working with you, the contract has gotten a little bit longer, a few more paragraphs here and there. I think as we all learn things.
Yeah, I mean, I like to try to keep the contract simple and not have too many clauses and also not have too many of those like standard clauses that don't really need to be in there. They do get longer because we do the Spanish, English, and the margins are thinner.
Right.
But that also helps a lot to have clear. And since most of the transactions we have people who only speak English or both languages, and for people to understand, the contract is valid both in Spanish and English. The main thing is that the person who signs the contract can understand the language. So if you're an English-speaking person, you need to sign a contract in English or have a translator translating if it were only in Spanish. So that's why we do them in both.
The other interesting thing is there's no gotchas in the Panamanian real estate contract. And I think that's not the case in other countries. In the US, you've got your original negotiation. This is the price. Then you have the inspection. Then there's another negotiation. And then by the time you get to the contract, there's another negotiation. Whereas here, the only negotiation is up front. And then nothing else is really negotiated because there aren't any gotchas to try to catch people who are kind of sleeping through the contract.
Yeah.
I find that refreshing.
It's refreshing. I also think I say in a different way, I try to avoid conditional contracts. So when we sign the promise of purchase agreement, have any of those clauses that are like, okay, so the seller needs to do this during the process or we can back out. Or, if this or so happens, I can back out. That's not ideal. And those things could lead to potential gotchas like you explained.
Right.
I try to tell clients, do your due diligence. If you need to do an inspection, hire an engineer, make sure that you understand everything. And then if there's something to be fixed, assess how much that costs and maybe negotiate that into the initial price. And then you do it the way you want to do it when you buy it. But let's try to sign a contract that you understand what you're buying and you're comfortable with the price that you're buying it. And that's what you're going to receive.
Great. Let's move on from contracts to titling and ownership.
Okay.
What are the differences between titled property and rights of possession, also called ROP property in Panama?
It's completely different. All right. Very simple. Titled property is property that is registered in the public registry. It has a property number and it has an owner. Rights of possession is property that does not have a title number. It's not registered in the public registry, and thus it's owned by the Panamanian government.
So if someone wants to buy property in Panama City, in Coronado Beaches area, most of those properties are going to be titled.
Correct.
But if you go over to the Caribbean side, a lot of those are going to be rights of possession. Would you recommend a client of yours get involved in a transaction with a rights of possession property?
No, not at all.
Me either.
Not at all. I mean, a lot of people think they're going to strike gold, but they don't understand how complicated the rights of possession is. Rights of possession means you just have it, which is simpler when you're talking about your cell phone, but it's harder when you're talking about land. And the main thing that I try to tell clients is, if this was simple to title, the guy who currently has the right of possession or claims to have the right of possession, he would have titled it already, because why would he be selling at 10 cents on the dollar when he could sell it to you at the dollar price? He doesn't have it titled because it's impossible to title, and thus he wants to sell it in rights of possession and leave that problem to you.
So let's keep the conversation focused then on titled property.
100%.
100%.
No, rights of possession, forget about that.
How long does the titling process usually take once a purchase is finalized?
Okay, well, generally that, first of all, depends on the buyer and his financing terms. So if you have a person who has the cash and is ready to buy, and the seller does not have a mortgage, these transactions can happen well within 30 days. We would put 30-day standard. I mean, once we sign the promise of purchase agreement, the seller and his lawyer can get all the good standings relatively quickly, a couple of weeks, and we can be ready for closing. So within 30 days, you can buy a property when the buyer has the money and the seller does not have a financing, which means a bank in the middle that needs to release the property.
Buying real estate in Panama isn't like buying back home. What you don't know can cost you. Before you search for properties online that might or might not be as advertised, go to choosepanama.com/contact and schedule a free 30-minute call. Our white glove service takes the stress out of buying abroad. So let's talk about the good standing certificates for a moment.
Okay.
What are the different things that have to have that certificate before a property can close?
Okay. The interesting thing in Panama difference that at least in the US, all the transactional taxes are paid before the closing. So you have to pay a transfer of title tax and you have to pay capital gains tax. Those are paid before the closing, and the good standing is transcribed in the public deed. You also have to provide the good standing on the HOA, that you don't owe anything to the building, on the water and garbage bill, on the property tax. If it's owned by a legal structure like a corporation or a foundation, it also has to be in good standing. So
And electricity.
And the electricity,
Yes.
correct.
And so then once that happens and you've submitted, again, you're selling a property, you've submitted your good standings so that by the time I get it, you start from scratch.
Correct.
Yeah.
So generally the seller obtains all these good standings and they deliver to the buyer all these good standings with a document that is done by the lawyer called the minute of sale, which has the price and all the details. That is elevated into a public deed, which then you go and sign. It could be at the notary, it could be at the lawyer's office, but basically it's taken to the notary, it's signed, the notary closes it, and then you take it to the public registry where it's presented, and generally that will be registered within 5 to 7 business days.
So if there is no bank involved, from the time promised to purchase until the time it comes out of the public registry, that can be 30 days, 45 days, maybe 2 months at the longest.
At the longest.
Let's talk about if there's a bank involved.
Okay.
So if either you as the buyer are getting a mortgage or you're dealing with a seller who has a mortgage on the property, what's the typical time frame involved?
Okay, let's start with the buyers getting a mortgage. If the buyer's getting a mortgage, it doesn't have to be much slower. The only difference here is that the bank has to provide the documentation, the guarantee of payment, of the final payment, and that the bank is the one that does the final deed and the registration of the property. Since it's a bank and not like your lawyer, let's just add on a couple of weeks of bureaucracy in that. But it's not terrible. It's slower when the property has a mortgage. The reason is because there's an amount owed to the bank, and the bank needs to release this property so it can be transferred to the buyer. How do you release the property? There's 2 ways. The buyer can just outright cancel the amount due on the property with a check, cash.
But that's paying ahead of time. So you're paying the bank
That is paying
when you
ahead of
don't
time.
own the property. Nobody wants to do that.
Correct. But that's one way. And the other is to provide a promise of payment letter, which is a guarantee of payment upon a condition. The condition is that the property is transferred to the buyer. So this you can obtain with your own bank account. You put the money in your bank account and you have the bank, your bank, issue a promise of payment letter in the name of the bank who the seller has for financing. The seller basically gets his bank to issue what's called a balance of mortgage letter that has the amount due to the bank. Your bank then issues a promise of payment letter for that amount. We give that to the seller who turns and gives it to his bank. Then his bank will take that as a guarantee and they will issue what's called a minute of cancellation of mortgage letter, which is signed by the bank. That document, which can take 3 weeks to obtain, then is delivered as part of the good standings to the buyer. Then that is also transcribed in the public deed along with all the good standings and authorizations. And then the deed is signed by the buyer and the seller. Then the deed has to be delivered to the bank who has the financing and they sign the deed as well. then the deed can be taken to the public registry for registration. So that's how you cancel the mortgage. And that's why you do have to tack on, I would say, 45 to maybe 60 calendar days additional when the property has a mortgage.
So instead of 6 to 8 weeks, it could be 4 months.
Yeah, I would say instead of like 30 days, it's more like 90 days.
We've been talking a lot about the process, but let's talk about how buyers outside of Panama can get the money for the purchase to Panama
Correct.
for a resale.
So that's always one of the things that when I first meet with a potential client or a client and they're getting ready, they're interested in buying a property, but they still haven't found the property. And they ask me what to do to prepare. One of the first things that I tell you is it would be very positive to move forward and open a bank account. Because if you can send the funds and already have the funds in your local Panamanian bank account, we can pay the down payment with a cashier's check. Also, for the final payment, like the most cost advantageous and secure way is just to issue a cashier's check for the final payment. Then when we sign it at the notary, we leave it in custody of the notary. And then the notary releases it to the seller once the property has been transferred. Also, if there's a bank, the seller has a mortgage, you can send the money to your own local Panamanian bank account and have them issue this promise of payment letter. I think it's very important to clear up that this can, like the seller, banks, Panamanian banks will only accept these promise of payment letters issued by a Panamanian bank. So even if you could get a promise of payment letter from your bank in the US or Canada, it won't be accepted here. So you do need to open a local bank account. If you don't have time, sometimes it happens, you go and the first property you see, you like, and it's a great deal and you want to move forward. This is very normal as well. We handle a lot of transactions where the buyer still doesn't have a bank account here. It is very easy to just send a wire transfer for the initial payment to the seller. And if it doesn't have a mortgage, it's also not a big deal. We can do the final payment through wire transfer as well, or use the time frame between the promise of purchase agreement and the closing to open a bank account where you can transfer the funds for the final payment and do the cashier's check. Where it can get more complicated is if you don't have a bank account and the seller has a mortgage, that can get complicated. And in those situations, you either open a bank account, or then I can also recommend you to set up a trust, which can serve as an escrow where you can send the funds and then they can do the service of doing the intermediation and issuing the promise of payment letter in the name of the financing bank for the seller. And that way you can also do the closing in a secure manner.
Yes. And for people who are Americans buying from Americans, there's one escrow company that you can use that will handle the transaction. But where it gets complicated again is if you have an American buyer and a non-American seller, because they don't want to use an American escrow account. So it depends on the situation of who the different parties are.
Yeah, definitely. Those are all things that are important to cover initially. Once you find the property and know who the seller is and see their preferences and understand the situation. But overall, if you have time to prepare, setting up a bank account and having your funds ready here in Panama would always be the best way to do it.
Let's talk about the cost. What are the taxes, fees, and closing costs that a buyer should expect?
A buyer. Okay, the buyer generally doesn't have what I would call high expenses. What is standard here in Panama is that the seller will obviously have the expenses of paying all the good standings, the taxes, transfer of title tax, and capital gains tax. The buyer is always responsible for what is his lawyer's fees and doing the registration of the property into his name. So basically, the buyer's lawyer is the one that's going to do the public deed and then take it to the notary and get it registered. And then you have to pay the registration fees at the public registry. The public registry charges $3 in registration fees for every 1,000 in value of the property. So for example, if a property is around $300,000, you can expect more or less like around 900 plus in registration expenses, plus the notary costs that are like around $150, plus your lawyer's legal fees, which, can be around 1,500, 2,500 total, let's say 3,000 at most, depending on the lawyer and the transaction.
So that's why a lot of times people ask me all the time, what are the closing costs? And it's like, well, it depends on what you're going to buy.
Yes, they're not a set percentage of the property, although there is like a lawyer's general code of what you should charge in these transactions, and they do it in a percentage. But if you do it in a percentage, it probably comes out at a higher cost or expense than if you just, for example, I generally just charge a standard fee for the promise of purchase agreement, which is an amount of hours, and then a standard fee for doing the public deed. And that generally will be less than like a percentage of the...
And I have worked with lawyers before who have said that they do charge the percentage because it's law. But I think that was probably said about because the properties used to be quite inexpensive in Panama when it was Panamanians buying them. So it might be a $90,000 property versus now there's a lot more properties that are $500,000, $1 million,
Correct.
$3 million.
Yes, that could be so. That's a good analysis. I do think ultimately the higher the purchase price, there will always be a little more stress and tension. It's just normal. If you're selling a property, whenever you're selling a property or buying a property, it's always a little more stressful than other like legal aspects. It always has a little personal side to it because the seller is selling his home or a property or an investment, and the buyer is buying a home. So there are things that make it a little more stressful and tense, but obviously if it's the higher the amount, there's a little more stress. So you can expect a little higher cost. It's normal to charge a little higher in legal fees or to incur in more legal hours when you're talking about higher amounts. And as you get over $1 million, etc., there's always a little more work that goes into it.
So once a transaction is completed, what are the taxes or expenses that foreign purchasers should be aware of?
There's really no ongoing taxes or expenses besides you're going to pay your HOA and there's a property tax on the property. Now, the property tax is kind of complex. There's properties that have a property tax exemption. There's others that don't. There's different property tax rates. And if you're very interested in that, well, we did a podcast that's specifically for property tax. We'll really go in depth.
I'll link it here
on that matter. And it would be really good to go and watch that to follow up on this.
Ricardo, what are the most common mistakes that foreign buyers make when purchasing property in Panama?
Ooh, finding a lawyer that doesn't speak English. And actually,
you've got to have it. If that's your only language, you need to have somebody who speaks English.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things. Number one is whenever you're buying property in a different country, you have to understand that you don't know everything. And you have to find good people to advise you. If you don't trust the advice of your lawyer or your realtor, the people who are guiding you, I think get new people.
Exactly.
Get new people. Get people that you can trust. You have to trust in the people who are the intermediators in this type of transactions that do them all the time. You can do a lot of research in the internet that does help, but there's also things that are mixed information and can confuse you. So I do think it's important to do research, but it's important to understand that you're in a foreign country, that you don't know the ins and outs. It's good to ask a lot of questions, and you will see the knowledge of the people who are advising you so they can advise you and answer all these questions to help you make better informed decisions.
Exactly.
Definitely, if you cannot communicate with your advisor because he doesn't speak English, I think that's terrible. decision. And then there's also people who just don't have anyone advising them because they think they can do everything on their own, or like, oh, they want to save on legal fees and they decide to use the other party's lawyer, which, depending on who it is and how you're doing the transaction, it can be, but you have to kind of know the situation and know what you're doing.
And one thing I say all the time is experience matters.
A lot.
As a broker, I've been doing this now. I'm in my 13th year. As a lawyer, you've been doing this for 20 years.
20 years. So 20 years.
You've done a lot of transactions, and you've hit a lot of the speed bumps and can guide people around those speed bumps.
100%. Like, there's a lot of things that I can immediately spot and just tell you, like, oh, we're going to have that problem, or don't go down this path because I've seen this before. It happens like this and that and the other. Mm-hmm. So yeah, definitely.
So what's the single best piece of legal advice you would give to somebody considering buying property here?
Legal advice. Well, I think definitely get a good realtor. And I also think number one is that I think how you express what you want to the people helping you, your realtor, your lawyer. I'm trying to get to know my clients and their wants and needs so I can on my end advise. I also think it's very important to come here and do a good trip. I think it's a fun trip to come to Panama for a week or two. You can do real estate, you can take advantage of the beautiful country and see all the properties and see everything, and overall I would say that most people are very happy with their properties and their transactions.
How early in the process should a buyer engage a Panamanian attorney?
Oh, I think it's, whenever you've decided that you're interested in buying a property, that would be a good time to at least do interviews with lawyers to see which one suits your needs. Right. Because there's also a personality thing. I think sometimes people don't understand, but whenever you're hiring like a professional service, maybe my personality is not a good fit for you. I don't know. But like there's better chemistry that you have with certain different people. So you can do your interview, see if this is the person that you feel will be best to advise you along the way, and kind of hit on the things that we've talked about to better prepare. So when you start looking at properties, you ask the right questions and get the right information, particularly once you see something that you like.
And I think there's also something with responsiveness. In your home country, it might be normal for people to respond within 24 hours. And in Panama, that's not normal. So I think it's important, if you want somebody to respond to you within 24 hours, you have to hire someone that's one of their missions.
Yes. One of the missions. I think also a very good question to ask whenever you're seeing a lawyer is, are you going to be the person working with me on this transaction? If no, who is going to be working with me on this transaction? And let me also talk to them and know who they are, how, because sometimes you could meet with a lawyer and then when the transaction comes, you're dealing with somebody else and maybe the main lawyer does have great responsiveness, but then the other lawyer doesn't.
Exactly.
So these are all good questions to ask.
Can your firm help people who don't speak Spanish, or maybe they're not physically present in Panama?
No, of course. You've described most of my clientele. Most of the transactions we handle, I would say the buyer is not present during the transaction. So I would say that most of my buyers do not speak Spanish. That's why we do the contracts in both languages. And we are, through either powers of attorney or through corporations and foundations, we're structured so we can handle everything. So a general flow that I see is that you come to Panama for a week or two and you go see properties. And generally, like, you'll always find the property like the last day. The last day,
true.
Just before you leave, like you're missing your flight and you see the property of your dreams.
Right.
And then you contact your lawyer, your realtor, you start doing the due diligence, make an offer, and we're equipped to handle the whole transaction and the whole process while you're back home. So you really don't have to worry about that.
Correct. If people want to get in contact with you or if they have more questions, how can they do that?
Okay, very easy. We have two websites, denfablaw.com and we have denfabimmigration.com. You can contact me at info@denfablaw.com or my email, which is on both websites, which is my first name and my last name, Ricardo Faraudo @denfablaw.com.
He says his name differently than I do. I'm not quite there with my Spanish yet.
Well, because you're trying to say it in English. I had to say it in Spanish because it's more difficult to say Faraudo.
I'm going to go ahead and put those in the show notes too for anyone who wants to get in contact, but maybe you don't have a pencil in front of you right now. They will be there in the show notes. So Ricardo, last words. Mm-hmm. Is there anything else you want foreign buyers to know before they begin their real estate journey in Panama?
I think it's a really good time to buy property in Panama.
I think so too. I think we're about to have our wave.
No, I think it's a good time. And also, it's a great country. Right now, I think it's a really good time to buy property. The properties. One of the things is the buildings here on resales are not that old. We had a big wave of construction started like 15 years ago. So most of the buildings that are in resale are 15, 10 years old, which are not that old. And there's a really good value on the price for those buildings right now, in my opinion.
Mine too. Ricardo, thank you so much for joining us and for sharing your legal expertise. Until next time, cheers.